Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and tonight we are celebrating one of the most underrated actors of Hollywood's golden age. From 1941, it's Tyrone Power in Blood and Sand, with an amazingly gorgeous supporting cast headed by Linda Darnell and, of course, the sultry Rita Hayworth. Joining us tonight is a film historian, and she's the author of the book Tyrone Power, Gender, Genre, and Image in Classical Hollywood. Please welcome Dr. Gillian Kelly. How are you doing tonight, Gillian?
Hi, I'm well. How are you, Ryan?
All right. So, as we were speaking briefly off camera, Tyrone Power was such a tremendous star in his day, in his era, but he may not be as much of a household name nowadays as someone like John Wayne or Clark Gable. So where was Tyrone Power? And please forgive me, I always go back and forth between, I want to say Tyrone Power, Tyrone Power. Where was he at this point in his career?
Yeah, so he started his career in 1936. He'd started in 1934 and got some bit parts and then went back to the stage. So he became a star overnight in 1936 with Lloyds of London. He was given the lead role, which was very unusual for, someone that early in their career. And from then on, he never played a supporting role. So he was always a leading man. So just before Blood and Sand, we've got The Mark of Zorro, which is obviously a very famous film now, probably one of his most famous. And then we get Blood and Sand, which is a very, spectacular film. So he was up there. And it's reflected in the credits for the film because it's 20th Century Fox presents Tyrone Power and then the name of the film. And then we get with Linda Darnell and Rita Hayworth. So it really shows his star power at the time and how, the studio, this big influential studio, is presenting him as their big star of the film. And then we have with the two women. So they're definitely seen as supporting roles. And they are, Rita Hayworth doesn't come into the film for about an hour. And Linda Darnell sort of disappears every so often. But, Tyrone's there most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned The Mark of Zorro. Of course, that movie, it's a personal favorite of mine. Also directed by Ruben Mamoulian, who's the director of tonight's film. Mark of Zorro sort of solidified Tyrone Power's image as this swashbuckling hero in the mold of someone like Errol Flynn, who is his contemporary over at Warner Brothers. And what's interesting, of course, famously, that film had been previously made in 1920 with Douglas Fairbanks. So Blood and Sand is interesting because this time Tyrone Power is stepping into the shoes of Rudolph Valentino.
Yeah, and he was very much like, they were his predecessors. I do talk about that in the book, how it is quite interesting that they remake these films and he is, he's got the dark, exotic looks, even though he's from Irish descent. He was the first Tyrone Power to be born in the US, and his other family members, like his father was Tyrone Power Sr., and he was English. And his great-grandfather also was on the stage as Tyrone Power, and he was Irish. So he's got sort of this like black Irish descent, but very much like exotic looks as well, even though he was all American. So it's quite interesting as well.
No, he certainly had a great look, and I thought he was definitely believable in these kind of Spanish roles, Mediterranean roles, as we would see in Zorro and tonight's film. So, what was the working relationship like with Linda Darnell? Obviously, they seem to be paired up quite frequently in the 1940s.
Yeah, so his first film that he did with her, he didn't actually want to star with her because she was still a teenager. I think she was 14 at the time, daytime wife, and they played a married couple. And he was in his early 20s and he thought that was a bit strange. But obviously when she grew up a bit, and she always had that look, she looked older than she was, and they really complemented each other, the dark hair and the beautiful looks as well. But what's interesting about this film is she's put into the background. So even though she's this, glamorous, beautiful woman, she's put into like grey dresses and her hair tied back while he's presented. He's sort of like a male peacock, and he's got the, you know, the glittering outfits to go into the bull ring. So it's very much like he's the star. We've got this beautiful woman, but we're sort of dressing her down. But yeah, they
Right.
got on really well. It seems he got on well with most people. He's a very affluent person to work with.
Oh, no, certainly. Now it's kind of funny, yeah. Like as you mentioned, Linda Darnell, an incredibly beautiful, glamorous woman, and it's kind of funny here watching her. She's supposed to be kind of like the modest housewife, you know. Whereas
Mhm.
you know, Rita Hayworth gets to be the bad girl. She's the glamorous one in this one.
Yeah. Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Because we've got this glamorous woman, but it's like, okay, she's sort of playing second fiddle, and she sort of says at one point, you know, I wish I was beautiful like she is, and you know,
Yeah,
it's kind of like, yeah, you are.
yeah, yeah. No, she's all right. But what do you? So at that time period, sort of at the height of his career, kind of pre World War II, what was the fan response like? Because nowadays, of course, if you want to read about a celebrity, just go on the internet. People can post their thoughts on social media. But at that time, like, what kind of fan mail was this guy getting? What kind of fan mail was the studio getting that they wanted to give him this big push as a
Yeah,
superstar?
he was getting a lot. Yeah, yep. From the very start, from Lloyd's of London, and it's quite interesting because he started appearing on international magazines almost instantly, which is kind of unheard of because magazines are trying to sell the stars on the cover to make
Hmm.
people buy them. Because that was the only way that fans could get access to stars, and if they weren't going to a cinema and watching the film on the screen. You know, in the
Hmm.
30s, 40s, we didn't have home video until the 70s. Um, and even then it was very limited. We clearly didn't have the internet. So they would buy magazines and they would be, you know, pin up pictures they could put on their walls. There'd be candid photos of the stars at home, obviously very staged as well, but it was like, you know, they're real, they're just like you and me, but they've also got this star power. So he
Hmm.
appeared on international magazines from very early on, you know, the glamorous photo shoots where there's, you know, highlighting either with a female star, his co-star, or he'd appear on his own. And I've actually written an article on, it's called Tyrone Power, the international cover boy, because it's amazing how many magazines he appeared on from very early in his career. And even when he was off in active war duty, he was still appearing on magazines for movies, even though he wasn't on the screen. So he was appearing in his real life uniform because he was part of the Marine Corps. And that would keep um, fans interested in him and interested in his return while he wasn't on the screen. So it was like, remember, we've got this big star, he'll be coming back. So all through his life, and even after he died, he was still appearing on magazine covers for the next few years.
Oh, certainly. Well, no, that's actually an interesting point. Yeah, so many of these great golden age Hollywood actors, like, you know, Henry Fonda, Jimmy Stewart, they went and fought in the war. And you have to keep in mind, yeah, this lasted a few years, so I'm sure the studios did all they could to keep them in the the public eye while they were away.
Yeah. I mean, quite a few of them appeared on magazine covers in their real life uniform, and a lot of them had played in war films. But this was like, you know, here's our stars, and they would be given their full titles, like Lieutenant Tyrone Power, yeah, Jimmy Stewart, Robert Taylor, Robert Montgomery. And obviously they were being replaced by leading men while they were away, but they were never sort of as big as these stars had been before they left.
Right. Which, of course, many of them, they were fortunate, like, of course, Jimmy Stewart, Tyrone Power, they were able to kind of come back after the war and pick up right where they left off.
Yeah, almost.
Almost.
They definitely had like a darker appeal. I mean, Hollywood in general had a darker side, but if we look at the films they made when they came back, like Tyrone Power went straight into The Razor's Edge, which is it's a film kind of like the post-war mentality. It's very much about isolation and alienation, and you know, not really fitting with the people around you who you used to fit with. And that was very much reflected in, men coming back from war and women being forced back into the home out of the jobs that they were in. So it sort of reflected society at the time. And Jimmy Stewart started making quite dark westerns with Anthony Mann. Robert Taylor went into a lot of like film noir. He played a lot of anti-heroes. So they were sort of changing as well. And what's quite interesting is their looks had changed while they were away. So it was only a couple of years. But they had started to harden a bit. So the pretty boy looks were gone, and it was more a sort of like solid handsomeness. Like we can see they're still handsome, but there's sort of this edge to them, and that's reflected in the characters that they play.
Right. Well, they definitely saw some stuff overseas, I can imagine.
Yeah, they did.
So, Dr. Kelly, if anyone's never seen a Tyrone Power movie before, what do they have to look forward to in Blood and Sand?
I think just if you know Tyrone Power at all, you might have seen some of his lightweight films possibly, or some of his swashbucklers, but I think this puts all of the elements together, because he's got comedy, he's got, he's quite like the cocky young man, and then there's different periods of his life within the film, and he really reflects that. He becomes a mature man in it. There's a lot of like subtle acting that he doesn't really get credit for because of his looks. And I think maybe he has a very strange haircut in it, to reflect the period. He's got this fringe down. So that sort of takes a little bit away from his outstanding looks. But like later on when he's with Rita Hayworth, like his hair gets slicked back a bit and he's sort of the Tyrone Power we know. But I think getting past that and looking at how good a performer he is, his eyes especially, like, he can really sell a scene. And I think people need to sort of sit back and have a look at how well he could act. So I think, if you're familiar with him or not, this gives a really good indication of how well he could act.
If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, with an amazing supporting cast featuring Anthony Quinn, Laird Cregar, and John Carradine, directed by Ruben Mamoulian, Blood and Sand. Well, that's still an incredibly powerful experience. And I feel like, Ruben Mamoulian, to me, he is one of the great Golden Age Hollywood directors. Before this, of course, as I mentioned earlier, he did Mark of Zorro with Tyrone Power. And before that, he did the Academy Award-winning 1931 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is a personal favorite of mine. Did Tyrone say anything about Ruben Mamoulian? Like, what was the working relationship like?
Yeah, I think he really respected him. He thought he was a really good actor, a really good director, and really knew what he was doing. And I think when you're doing like spectacles like that, your actors really have to trust you, to sort of create his vision. I mean, I haven't heard anything about Tyrone Power not getting on with anyone, which, when I started researching him and I found that out, and his children have also sort of said, that was true, and none of his wife spoke ill of him either, even after divorces, and that speaks well about someone. Everyone that he worked with on stage and in cinema and television all said he was such a nice man, and even gave too much of himself, some people said. George Sanders, in his autobiography, Memoirs of a Cad, he actually said Tyrone gave so much of himself that he gave too much in the end, and that's why he had a heart attack and died so young, because he was only 44 when he died. And it was on the set of Solomon and Sheba with George Sanders, so he must have felt bad about that as well. But he said he tried to please everyone too much, which, when we look at glamorous stars, that might seem a surprise to us as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of, I'm glad you brought that up, and to go into your earlier point about how a lot of these men, when they came back from the war, they were visibly aged, they look a little bit different. And I don't know, I believe Tyrone Power's family did have a history of heart issues, correct? Or like he wasn't the first one in his family.
Apparently he was told about some stuff from the doctor and he didn't go ahead and get it checked. And that maybe added to it.
Well, I was just going to say, like, if you look at images, towards the end from around the time of Solomon and Sheba, obviously he's still very handsome and distinguished, but he looks much older, like by today's standards, than a man of 44
Yeah,
at that
yeah,
time. So he did look
yeah,
visibly aged at that time.
yeah. And he did smoke a lot as well, and drank, which most of them did at that time. But yeah, he does. He sort of, when he comes back from the war, obviously he's slightly hardened, but he's still very handsome. But yeah, when we get to Witness for the Prosecution, which was his final completed film, he looks much, much older. You know, he looks at least 10 years older than he actually was. And
Hmm.
there's very stark lighting used in that film. But apparently he wanted to age, he wanted to look bad because he wanted to be taken seriously as an actor and he thought his looks were getting in the way. So I think, if he had aged, he'd probably been happier with that.
It's almost kind of sad. We take it for granted now. I feel like the cliche, when we look at Hollywood actors nowadays, we always feel like that's a burden that women have to deal with mostly, right? If you're young and attractive, you don't get the really meaty roles. You don't get taken seriously. But it is kind of interesting when you look at actors like Tyrone Power, or we recently did a presentation on Rock Hudson, and he was another one who I feel like he's a genuinely underrated actor. He was charismatic, he was likable, but I think people just sort of, oh, he's just like the big hunk, right? He's not,
Yeah,
he's not a serious actor, right? How can
yeah,
you be if you look like that?
yeah. And I think it still happens today. Like people will say, like, oh, it's very much women are being objectified and women and aging, and obviously it's an issue, but it's always been for men as well. And I think Valentino died so young that he didn't get to age. Robert Taylor, he died at 56, so he sort of got into middle age, and his look started to fade, and he changed the roles he was in. Tyrone Power died at 44. He was still a leading man, um, but it was very much like, oh, he's starting to look a bit older, and how much longer can this go on? I mean, Cary Grant, for example, he retired, um, because he thought he couldn't do anything but romantic leading roles. And when he was paired with Audrey Hepburn in Charade, who was 25 years younger than him, he said, only if she chases me will I do the film because it's going to start looking creepy. And he sort of knew his limits. So he was like, I'm going to retire. I can't be a character actor. Um, and Tyrone Power, he'd shown some character acting, like in the Long Grey Line. He had to age 50 years in that film, and he sort of showed he could do character acting. And I think he would have been able to have continued. Rock Hudson, obviously, he did age and continue, but they never stay the big stars that they were. I mean, it's the same today. We look at someone like Johnny Depp, whose looks are always talked about, and they're like, oh no, he's starting to look old, and he's 60. What age is
Hmm.
he supposed to look? And I think there's people who, it's all about their looks, and their acting ability is overlooked because every comment on Instagram will be like about someone's looks. When they're, a skilled performer. Someone like Henry Cavill today as well, every comment's about, oh, he's beautiful, oh, look at the size of him. And it's like, he's a good actor, he's a,
Hmm.
he's a skilled actor. So that must get frustrating for the performers as well.
Well, I think it's probably healthier for all of us to stay off social media, especially if you're a movie star. I would not want to
Yeah,
Google myself
exactly,
if I
yeah.
were famous. So at that time, when he passed away, was it sort of like an Elvis Presley moment in the United States? Was there like an outpouring of grief? How did the public receive this news?
Because it was so sudden, it was definitely an outpouring of grief. He had just recently got married, so he'd got married 2 months before he died, and his only son, Tyrone Power Jr., the actor, was on the way, and he'd always wanted a son. He had two daughters with his second wife, Linda Christine, and yeah, so he never got to see his son being born. So because I think it was so sudden, he was making a film. He looked, quite virile in the film, and it was, yeah, some of the newspapers, some of the magazines couldn't quite believe it. And his funeral was, he had a military funeral because he was a lieutenant in the Marine Corps. And apparently, like, people were camping out at the cemetery and having picnics and stuff, which was, very disrespectful. But yeah, there wasn't many people allowed inside the church. But it was for a few months afterwards. International magazines were still having cover images with him, and sort of, the stories of, like, we can't believe he's gone. But then he sort of faded out after that.
I don't want to bum out the audience too much, but I think it should be noted that Linda Darnell also had a tragic ending in her own right.
She was in her 50s and she died in a house fire. She was actually staying with friends and she was sleeping on their sofa and she couldn't get out. Yeah, she was it 56 or something like that?
And what was it?
Rita Hayworth as well. She got early Alzheimer's, which at the time wasn't understood. And remember, like, she'd divorced Orson Welles, but he was like, yeah, there's something definitely going on. I think some people just thought she was an alcoholic or something, but he was like, yeah, there's something. Then it was discovered she'd got Alzheimer's when she was still in her 40s.
And that's awful. And then, I'm reminded too, Laird Cregar, I think he died pretty young. He had a rapid weight loss. And he passed
wasn't
away.
he still in his 20s or something? He looked a lot older, but yeah, he was. I think John Carradine lived a grand old age though. So
no, John Carradine and Anthony Quinn, I think they lived to be 100 and had a bunch of kids.
Yeah, exactly.
They had a happy ending, I think.
Yeah, and John Carradine, he was a co-star for Tyrone Power in a lot of films. They did a lot of work together.
Like, I think of Jesse James, right? He was Robert Ford, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep. And Son of Fury as well, they did together in quite a few.
Yeah, John Carradine, he was always one of my favorite character actors.
Oh, he's excellent, isn't he? Yeah.
Oh, he's incredible. I mean, I grew up on the Universal Monster movies, so when I think of John Carradine, I think of Dracula. That's the first image I have. But then I've also... I'm quite friendly with the John Wayne estate, so I know John Wayne's son and granddaughter, and we talk about those old John Ford movies. John Carradine pops up in a lot of those great, of course, like Stagecoach and a lot of others. He's always fun to see in whatever he.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he's good in this as well. He's not in it a lot in Blood and Sand, but when he is there, he's really good.
No, absolutely. And it's rare to see John Carradine at this time in full Technicolor. You're always used to seeing him in black and white.
I mean, that's the other thing. That Tyrone Power's 26th film, I believe, Blood and Sand, but it was only second in colour. The first was Jesse James. So yeah, it was unusual to see Tyrone Power in colour as well.
But he made a few great ones, like you said, Jesse James. Another wonderful film is The Captain from Castile, which that has amazing Technicolor photography, location photography in that one. I apologize if this is too gossipy. I mean, the subtitle of your book, gender, genre. When we go back to the gender, as you mentioned, obviously Tyrone Power is a very attractive, likable man. If you're a leading man in Hollywood, you're going to be a bit of a playboy, a bit of a player. But then I've heard rumors that he was the boyfriend of Cesar Romero. Is there any basis to that? Like, what have you come across?
No, they were just friends. And apparently Cesar Romero wasn't even gay. But
really?
It's
because I had always heard that he was. Sir.
Facade. There's two books on Tyrone Power that came out strangely in the same year. I think it was 1978 when he died in 1958. One of them talks about all his affairs with women. The other one talks about all his affairs with men. So between all of that, he wouldn't have been able to make any films. I mean,
how did he get any sleep if he's just
absolutely no credit to any of the homosexual rumours. His wife say not at all. I mean, there's been rumours linking him to Errol Flynn and all sorts of people. But yeah, and Lana Turner was like, he was the big love of her life, and she said absolutely was there no men involved. I mean, there was women. He had affairs with quite a few women, even when he was married. But yeah, apparently the rumours of the men, none of them are true. And I
What?
think, because people are beautiful, they sort of people also think they're also gay, which it doesn't always go. But yeah, apparently none of that's true.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think the biggest news I found out today was apparently Cesar Romero was straight because I feel like he was always associated. I think Cesar Romero's nickname was Butch, if I'm not mistaken. So,
I think
okay.
because he never got married, he was a bachelor, and that sort of meant you were gay then. But apparently he wasn't, and his family have confirmed that he wasn't, which I just assumed he was. But apparently it was just, someone wrote a biography at one point, and it was the same with Tyrone Power. Like if you look him up, there's a lot of stuff about him being bisexual, but it
Hmm.
is based on this one book that was written in the 70s, which to me, reading it, just sounds like someone's, gay fan fiction, because it's none of this stuff that can be proven. It's two people in a room with a secret um,
Yeah.
conversations. It's like what you basing this on? Where are your facts coming from? Um,
Well, I
Obviously,
guess
we
that.
can never truly know, but yeah,
Yeah. Well, I guess that's the curse of beauty. Everybody wants to be with you. So,
exactly.
what can you do? Do you have any closing thoughts on the film?
I think just the spectacle of it, I think, is quite unusual for the time. Like we're saying, it's in full Technicolor. It's over 2 hours long, and you've got Tyrone Power in this glamorous role. Even the wardrobe must have cost a fortune. He's got all these sequin outfits, the bullfighting scenes. That some people might find a bit gory today, but nothing's really shown. Obviously it's quite a controversial sport now, but it concentrates more on the background, the rise to fame of his bullfighter, and I think it sort of closely relates to his real life as well, sort of his climb to fame within film. And obviously we've got our two glamorous leading ladies as well. We've got our supporting cast. So I think just it's an enjoyable spectacle that sort of goes through a lot of different stages as well.
Hmm. No, absolutely. So, what was the audience response like at the time? What did the critics say?
Yeah, it did really well. The critics actually said not to downplay Valentino, but this was better. And I think Tyrone Power's acting in it maybe shocked some of the critics, because a lot of the male critics, especially, were like sort of dismissed him as, oh, he's just beautiful. He makes comedies and musicals and stuff. And then they were like, actually, this sort of proves that he can act. And it's quite a manly sport as well. So he proved he could be like both masculine and beautiful. And also it made 1.75 million for the studio, which in today's money is like about 65 to 70 million. So we have to sort of consider that was in the 40s.
Hmm.
And obviously it's going to cost a lot to make the film. So if they're making that in profit, then it really does show that it was a popular film.
Well, that's good to hear because I feel like it still holds up today, all these years later.
It does, yeah. Because even though it is about bullfighting, which can be seen as a bit controversial now, you have all the personal relationships that go on behind the scenes, and it starts off with his childhood, which a lot of Tyrone Power films do. So he doesn't enter it until 20 minutes in, and then we sort of get his journey to adulthood and at the top of his game, which really did reflect the actor at the time.
It's funny. I'm glad you mentioned that because the format of it does remind me, like you said, we see his childhood, we see his relationship with his mother who's trying to convince him to get out of the game. The structure of it reminds me a lot of like those classic pre-code gangster movies like The Public Enemy or Scarface, where you see the gangster kind of from boyhood to adulthood. And then I think of like Scarface in both versions where you have the mother saying, "No, Tony, I don't want you in this life. Get out of this life. You're going to get killed in the end." So it's interesting that this movie follows. It's obviously not a gangster movie, but it follows a similar trajectory.
Yeah, and I think he is a bit of an anti-hero as well, because he does things that we think, why is he doing that? When he goes off with Rita Hayworth and stuff, and sort of slaps his best friend and stuff. So there is that sort of like it's not black and white characters. So there is sort of some sort of gangster stuff in it as well, and he can't read and write. He's never learned that. He's very cocky to begin with. I'm the best. And yeah, he's sort of brought down a peg or two by his mum, by his wife, by his friend, by everyone around him. So he's humbled by the end.
Oh yeah, no, certainly. And I think about another supporting actor in the film in a small role. We have a young George Reeves as Rita Hayworth's boyfriend. So if you're a comic book fan, I always just kind of found it amusing. It's like, okay, we have George Reeves, Superman, sitting across from Zorro at the dinner table. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, and Lynn Barry's in it as well in a very small role as Tyrone Power's sister, which I missed until I watched it today. Actually, I was like, oh, that's Lynn Barry.
So, Gillian, is there anything else you're working on right now you want the audience to know about?
Yep, so just finished a book on Ray Milland, which is going into it's getting copy edited soon, so I'm just doing the final formatting on that. So he was the first Welshman to win the Best Actor Oscar for The Lost Weekend, directed by Billy Wilder. The first film to take alcoholism serious in Hollywood. Won lots of Oscars. And he also had a career from 1929 in sort of semi-silent British cinema to 1985, and he died in 1986. So he had a really long career. So it's looking at different elements of his career and his struggle to become a star. He was very unlike Tyrone Power and Robert Taylor as well, in that it took him many years to become a star. The Lost Weekend was like his 16th film, and he sort of became a star with that, and then his star sort of faded again. So it's sort of reappraising his career, different stages of it. He's working on another book on Ida Lupino, so with the first woman. So the only woman directing in 1950s Hollywood, who was born in London and was also from a theatrical family. So I'm looking at her career as an actress and as a director. Because again, very underrated actress who her acting's not really been studied. She was sort of rediscovered in the 70s by the feminists who looked at the films she directed. But she's such a good actress even from early on. She had her first romantic lead role when she was 14. And she's sort of, she's straight in there with good voice control, good facial gestures, all of that. Whereas some of these guys that I've looked at, their first roles, they've got high-pitched voices, they look nervous. It takes a few years for them to get into the roles. But she obviously had such a good legacy behind her that she started strong.
Well, I'm inviting you right now. If I ever do High Sierra, would you be interested in talking about that?
Yeah, I do mention that in the book. Yeah, it's quite a good one.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Gillian Kelly, once again, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
All right, if you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed tonight's discussion as much as we had having it. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.